It's been a little over a year now since I started uploading regularly to my YouTube channel, and it's been a crazy journey so far. I started doing Spooky Sublevels, a series where I check out different sublevels from the Backrooms fandom and Wikidoc communities and talk about them. Then I took a big chance at trying something really different, which was trying to incorporate actual physics and other scientific fields in my analysis of Kane Pixel's Backrooms series, and a lot of you guys really ended up liking it. It shook me to my very core and solidified my motivation to keep uploading videos. Truly, you guys have no idea how much that reception meant to me. Anyway, before I keep going and getting sappy and emotional about it, I wanted to do something fun. So, like I mentioned, it's been about a little over a year since I uploaded that theory video, and I wanted to upload something lifeform and complex/green light theory related to celebrate. So, I'll be uploading a couple different videos talking about these topics. This video will cover the hints that tell us if the complex knows what to create, how it does it, why it does it, and the concepts behind all of this speculation. As always, I want to extend my sincerest thanks and lots of love to the community in the Kane's Facility Discord server and mine for theorizing with me, giving me ideas that send me down hours-long rabbit hole reading sessions, and of course for contributing your own thoughts and perspectives on these theories. None of these videos would be possible without you guys. I also want to give a huge thank you to both Kane and Brugly for not only taking the time to watch my videos and enjoying them, but also shouting me out. You guys are incredible and I really appreciate you guys. Speaking of the video, let's get complex. So there's been quite a bit of speculation that's been going on over the past year as to what exactly the complex is, as well as the nature behind it and its distinct phenomenon of expansion, time displacement, and creation of null zones. We've heard everything from the complex is a computer program made by Async to the complex is an extension of Ivan's consciousness to the complex is AI. But what is it, really? I mean, there's a couple things it could realistically be at this point. It could be an inverted plane that is connected to ours. It could be a paradoxical system, or it could be something completely theoretical. In my opinion, I want to say that it's some kind of weird combination of these three factors. There's just something so psychological about the complex and the way it relates to Ivan that makes me think there has to be something about Ivan that the complex itself used in order to become material, especially given the context of the accident Ivan had in Overflow and the incidents that followed it. We, of course, have to mention Overflow because it's the reason all of this is even happening to begin with. I've pointed this out a few times before, but the beginning and ending of Overflow actually reveal more than you realize. The beginning of Overflow shows a normal starry sky with plenty of clouds. The ending, on the other hand, seems to not only have reflected the image, but there's a rotation effect in the lower left-hand corner. These reflection and rotation motifs show up again in I Remember, and they're way more noticeable and complex. It's also important to note that while Overflow is the first chronological video in the series, it seems like I Remember is meant to take place towards the climax or near the end of the series. To me, this implies that whatever distortion was introduced into Standard on the night of Overflow only continued to worsen as time went on, and I believe this is directly tied to the state and stability of the complex. Take Found Footage 2 for example. We know that this found footage tape takes place in August of 1995, and it shows the complex in a weird semi-unstable state. There are flashes of green light everywhere, and the furniture generated in this section of the complex is not only scattered, but it's also quite distorted, often appearing way bigger or taller than usual, like the giant and elongated dining room set for instance, or the sectional in a giant open room, which if you were on HGTV, the realtors would be describing this as the ultimate open concept living space. You also have the seemingly bigger than California king-size bed, the lone kitchenette and stove with a range hood, and this random lamp next to the green light in the pool room's inspired section. Not to mention the very end of the video where Madison is completely surrounded by the green light and either gets zapped, caught in the expansion, or manages to somehow no-clip out of the complex while this event is happening. If we're to believe that the year Ravi fell into the complex was 1997 from the context clues we get at the very beginning of Found Footage 3, then why doesn't that section of the complex show more instability? Especially since it's much bigger than the section Madison fell in, and this takes place 2 years later. Could this mean that different sections of the complex are inherently more stable than others? One potential idea that was floating around in the community is that the complex is affected by real-world advancements in physics. For instance, the second superstring revolution occurred in 1995, the same year that Found Footage 2 takes place. Maybe real-life experiments or advancements in fusion and physics affect the integrity or properties of the complex due to it experiencing the same space-time manipulations that standard does? This instability is also hinted to us during Pitfalls and Static Dead End, where in Pitfalls, the entrance to the red neighborhood was turned at an angle, as if the wall were rotating as the hallway expanded, and the Static Dead End being a direct copy of the Pitfalls room, only glitchy and incomplete, and with a seat fit for a king of the hill.
Dang it, Bobby.
Like I mentioned earlier, these hints imply that the complex has areas with varying levels of stability. Some are significantly more stable than others, and this may be due to any and all null zones that exist within that area. But before I dive into the nature of the null zones, we have to examine the nature of the complex itself once again. So I wanted to ask the community what their general ideas and thoughts on what the complex is and why they think that. And I got really interesting responses. Happy Egg and Ivor Alderson think that it's another universe that copies things from standard, and because it's always expanding, it never ends. Ivor even added that they believe that there was only a void before the complex. Ultraliminalist added that the complex is likely infinitely expanding, as nothing seems to suggest a continuous spatial boundary. Eris compared the complex to a holodeck simulation someone left running on the Enterprise, and it's gotten worse than the James Moriarty simulation. A haunting situation of fooling a hologram into thinking that they had indeed escaped their confinement and were on a journey despite still being locked in the computer. A real ghost in the machine, if you will. Doodlebag was very poignant and simply said that it's hell. Other answers by Chem, Time, and DJ9000 say that the complex is a recreation of the outside world, aiming to become a copy of reality so that those who inhabit it don't go crazy. It does this by attempting to copy reality from the memories of those who fall into it. Astra mentions that the relationship between the complex and standard is like yin and yang. They both rely on each other in order to be able to exist. Astra then goes on to discuss that the different areas of the complex we see are actually reflections of standard, and other sections of the complex are either unseen to us or incomprehensible, or they just don't exist yet. They also speculate that messing and tampering with the complex will affect standard as well, since they're both intertwined. And this intertwining effect is making the complex more chaotic and unstable, which by extension begins to plague standard. Susie mentioned that the complex is probably a mind, and Robin mentions that he thinks it's probably a manifestation or projection of what the complex took from Ivan during Overflow. Vil also thinks that the complex is the result of human brains connecting with the very nature of the universe itself. He mentions that this could have occurred during Overflow, and because of that, the entire universe itself is mirroring the properties of a human brain and human psychology. He describes the complex as a subconscious mind where all the memories the universe experiences reside. Broken Lavender had a lot of ideas, and among those he wondered if the complex is like an event, a warped region in space-time in the shape of an impossible object. He mentioned that the initial contact to the complex opened the door into an inevitable merger of standard and the complex, and the null zones are a result of them. He also posits that the instability of the complex could in part be due to the limited amount of information that was taken during the events of Overflow. All these viewpoints and perspectives not only helped me think about and approach the complex from a variety of different angles, but it also helped me solidify some of my own speculation as to what I think the complex is. In my Ivan Beck and the complex theory video, I discussed that I think the complex is an example of a projective space created by Ivan during the events of Overflow, and I still think this. More specifically, I think that Ivan Beck and the complex are entangled on a quantum level, especially since the green light itself does seem to be directly tied to the expansion of the complex and possible no-clip properties as seen in the end of Found Footage 2 and Found Footage 3, as well as it being the same green light we saw during Overflow. Found Footage 3 seems to have green light noises when Waldad opens the wall, presumably no clips in, and then is no longer able to talk to Ravi after the noises dissipate.
What the fuck? What? Oh my god. Oh my god, what the fuck?
Found footage 2 has that split second just before the green lights appear where you can see the entrance of the room Madison is in begin to slowly expand. And of course, we see the green light off screen during overflow as we zoom into Ivan's bulletin board. This idea would play into fields like projective geometry, M-theory, cosmology, and of course, phenomenology. More specifically, string phenomenology. Projective geometry is defined as the branch of mathematics that deals with the relationships between geometric figures and the images, or mappings, that result from projecting them onto another surface. An example of this I discussed once before is the concept of stereographic projection, a method for mapping points on a sphere to a plane. So like taking a world globe and then making a map from it. What I had in mind was a projective space being created and anchored into standard, and Ivan the instant Ivan got hurt during the accident. Ivan would essentially act as the globe whose map is then projected onto another space, thus resulting in the complex. This would also tie into instances of things like stereographic projection being referenced from the home movie video that follows found footage 2, as well as the appearance of maps or coordinates being shown in first contact as async establishes the connection to the complex, and in a found footage 3 teaser, respectively. So how would this projective space be described then? Does it exist in a higher dimension than we do? Is it a new plane altogether? I mean, it seems to be, although it seems to be directly attached to standard. Think of it like looking into a nice clear lake on a sunny day. The reflection casted on the surface of the lake makes it look like there's another copy of our world right beneath our feet. I feel like that's one of the best representations of the connection between standard and the complex that I can provide. However, it does seem like the transition between standard and the complex not only displaces you in space, but in time as well. This is shown to us not only in found footage 1 and found footage 3, but also in informational video. Why is this then? Well, this is where the very complicated physics come into play. So I hope you're ready for physics 301 with Red. Earlier, I mentioned the concepts that I believe the narrative utilizes to explain the complex. We already went over projective geometry, so let's talk about M-theory. M-theory is not just a theory that unifies all consistent versions of superstring theory, it also aims to describe the existence of 2- and 5-dimensional brains. And that's not brain as in the chunk of meat chilling in your head, I mean brains. These are physical objects that generalize the notion of a 0-dimensional point particle, a 1-dimensional string, or a 2-dimensional membrane to a higher dimensional object. They also propagate through space-time thanks to quantum mechanics and having other attributes such as a charge. Think of it as a membrane, like a bubble or a shower curtain. Another example would be a garden hose. To you and me, it may just look like a 1-dimensional line chilling on the ground, but to something like, say, an ant, it needs to factor in the width of the hose, something we typically don't do unless we're actively using it. There's also a working theory that our universe might be a 3-dimensional brain embedded in a higher dimensional space, known as the bulk. So could it be possible that the plane the complex exists within is simply another brain that Ivan connected to during the events of overflow? The complex is an enigma. The only reason it exists is because of Ivan, but because Ivan exists, the complex therefore has always existed. So when you're dealing with a paradoxical situation like that, how can you even begin to describe what kind of a place it is? Well, it's not easy. Remember, a lot of the science behind quantum physics and mechanics is very theoretical. And while we have a bunch of theories that describe and suggest a bunch of concepts and explanations, we still don't have an official theory of everything, per se, that would be able to let me describe to you what the complex could be. But I can still try. See, the combination of all consistent versions of superstring theory include concepts and ideas like the existence of higher dimensional planes. And for these dimensions to exist, they need to be compactified. From all the research into M-theory scientists have conducted so far, it seems like any attempts to connect it into experiments require compactifying these higher dimensions to construct candidate models of the 4-dimensional world. They can end up looking like this or like this. But the point is that these dimensions all seem to be connected to each other in some way, shape, or form that allow properties from these other dimensions to affect our own. An example of this is that graviton experiment I mentioned in one of my prior videos. The reason physicists believe we haven't been able to locate the fundamental particle that mediates gravity, the graviton, is because it's believed that it immediately disappears out of our own dimension into another. However, physicists believe we've been able to rarely get hints at the existence of gravitons due to uneven particle numbers after some collision events. So does this mean that the complex exists on another plane or brane and Ivan's simply connected to it during overflow, thus projecting whatever limited information was taken to bring the complex to form? Or if we go back to that "you have always been here" quote from who I presume to be Ivan and I remember, then this would start to tread into a more paradoxical and involved explanation. My main theory is that some part of Ivan's consciousness was taken during overflow, and that information was then used to create the complex. It would explain why every clock we see in the complex is set to 7:16, which is Ivan's birthday, July 16th. Not to mention that the project name for research into the low proximity magnetic distortion system itself references Ivan's birthplace and birth year, Karlovy Vary, and 1931, aka KV31. We also know that the complex seems to expand, fix, and generate things all on its own. It doesn't seem like it requires anything prior to these events occurring. But these events aren't perfect in any circumstance. You have distorted looking rooms with furniture that have very uncanny proportions. You've got certain places from both within the complex and standard being generated and reused over and over again. And of course, the creatures. However, there's a lot of similarities in these events. There's, of course, the fact that the complex seems to generate areas from standard as a part of its ever-expanding structure, but there's also a focus on art and music, something I discussed in one of my prior Ivan Beck theory videos. We know Ivan was interested in these topics as seen by the various paintings found within the complex. But if we take our latest theory about still life into account, then perhaps in an attempt to make the complex more like standard, it has begun to create humans. I mean, I can't really think of any other reason why Kane would specifically choose the name Still Life for this creature, knowing that we know about Ivan's interest in art, other than the possibility that Ivan has some grander role to play in the way the complex functions. It would also explain the caveman cutout we see, the behavior of Still Life itself, and the image Kane picked to overlay during the 1-hour loop of Still Life he released on his second channel. All of these are references to prehistoric humans, the way they looked, their behaviors, even their way of living. So perhaps the complex is employing its own version of evolution, which would also mean that the life form is simply one of the attempts at creating humans, probably the very first one. Why do I think this about the life form specifically? Well, you're gonna have to watch my video on my updated life form theory that may or may not be out when you watch this video. But if that's the case, and the complex is simply another brain or universe type thing, then how does it gain the rest of the information needed to create things like entire cities or neighborhoods, for instance, or even some places like the chasm? Well, I think that it's due to the null zones themselves. See, we've talked a lot about null zones and their connection to the green light, as well as the expansion events, but we don't really understand what they're used for or why they even exist after async connects to the complex. So let's dive into what I think that reason could be. Null zones are described as a KX field, aka an electromagnetic field, that is created due to an elevation discrepancy, something that I personally think references some sort of localized gravitational anomaly. I specifically think this because every time we see someone fall into a null zone, it looks like they're almost sucked downwards into the ground. This is best shown in Found Footage 2, when Madison's sustained interaction with the null zone causes it to suddenly expand and pull all surrounding objects and people into the complex. This specific diagram is shown to us in the archive.tar video as a blurry image. There are some things about this video and the diagram that always stood out to me though, and there's something that I haven't seen many people talk about. This video seems to have old photos of Async's activities and experiments. We see researchers actively observing the complex while they're in the outpost, and of course we have that diagram describing what a null zone is. But if you remember from Pitfalls, the team didn't know much about what null zones were. In fact, Marvin wonders aloud whether the gap in the wall that leads to the red neighborhood is a null zone.
under the gap in the wall.
You need to stay at the hole. George will be back any minute, then we can assess the situation from there.
Shh. But what if Miller's right about the null zones?
I don't think the diagram was created around the same time, because the video itself mentions that the archive was compiled in June of 1991. Pitfalls took place in May of 1990, so we have about 13 months before the archive was compiled, which is plenty of time for Async to find out and describe what exactly the null zones are. Take a good look at this diagram though. The red highlighted area is marked as the null zone itself, with the sections of the tiles taped off to show where the recorded elevation discrepancies are. The null zone section is bigger than most of the null zones we've seen so far. The video, titled with the ISBN code for the yellow wallpaper, has a big null zone that let a car fall through. Found Footage 1 had a small null zone big enough for Kane to trip and fall through. Found Footage 2 had probably one of the smallest null zones that we've seen so far that expanded after Madison interacted with it for a sustained period of time. And of course, Found Footage 3 has that giant gap in Robbie's basement wall that seems to be a significantly more stable null zone. We've seen that people and objects can fall into the complex through these null zones, so that made me wonder what else can go into the complex through the null zones. I stopped thinking about the complex and null zones in a physics sense and tried to lean more into my entangled consciousness theory to try and make sense of both of them. If the complex is essentially recreating things and people from its memory, then it must get the information from somewhere. After all, it only theoretically took a portion of Ivan to come into existence, so how and where else would more information get learned and used? Well, that's where the null zones come into play. Welcome to Psychology. I'm gonna be honest with you, I forgot what I said for my last psychology section in like an old video, so I'm just gonna say 201. Who knows if that's even right. Anyway, I had the thought that these null zones are a sort of perceptual system which allows information to be learned by the complex. First, I should discuss what a perceptual system is before we go any further. A perceptual system is a computational system, either biological or artificial, designed to make inferences about properties of a physical environment based on scenes. Scenes, in this case, would be defined as sensory information that can flow from a physical environment into a computational system through sensory transduction. A sensory organ, once again either biological or artificial, is used to capture this information. Therefore, a perceptual system must incorporate input from at least one sensory organ. These systems include the visual system, the auditory system, the olfactory system, the somatosensory system, a sonar/echolocation system, a man-made light meter, or a man-made motion detector. To me, the null zones seem to let in limited audio and visual information, and I believe that the accuracy and amount of information that is let in is dependent on the size and stability of the null zone. Some areas have been shown to be more complex in their environments, like the Red City, while other areas have been shown to be significantly more unstable, like the section of the complex that Madison fell into. If we take into account the location of Found Footage 2 and its proximity to the section Kane wandered in during Found Footage 1, then we can also predict the change in stability between when Kane fell in versus Madison. Whether you think the majority of Found Footage 1 takes place in 1991 or 1996, it still highlights that there was seemingly a period of stability in that greater section during Found Footage 1 versus Found Footage 2. In Found Footage 1, you see the green light once in that hallway Kane glances at before going in the opposite direction. But in Found Footage 2, that green light is everywhere. So this suggests a vast amount of expansion events occurring while Madison is in the complex. Was the complex receiving more information by the time Madison fell in and was rapidly trying to generate and replicate what it could? I believe so. We know for certain that Found Footage 2 took place in 1995, and that seems to be one of the furthest points in the timeline that we have thus far. I imagine that as time went on, more stable null zones began appearing, thus allowing a vast amount of information to flow into the complex and create more stable and normal looking environments. But maybe these null zones hadn't reached that point of stability that Found Footage 3 displayed, and as such, the effects of these unstable null zones appearing in Standard were felt in the complex as well, leading to the vastly different states we see the complex behave in during each of the Found Footage tapes. So why then would these null zones act as perceptual systems? Because the complex is meant to be a sort of recreation of Standard. The environments it creates are meant to be a sort of snapshot of wherever in Standard these null zones happen to exist in. That's why the smaller null zone in Madison's garage led to a weird and disjointed version of a person's house, and the null zone in Waldad's house from Found Footage 3 ended up copying his entire house, even down to the bottle of Jack on the table and the Billy Bass on the wall. I actually had a thought as I was writing this down initially, but if the null zones create snapshots of their environments, and Ravi happened to fall into a section of the complex that had a city, then maybe there were significantly more stable null zones in Ravi's city than we realize. There are also various elements that lead me to believe that the null zones are meant to sort of act like the complex's eyes and ears. The multiple references to eyes, not just in the series itself, but also in the music covers for the Out of Sync tracks, as well as the writing on the wall in Found Footage 1, the God closed his eyes and it hears writing spam to be specific. We also know that Ivan is implied to be blind in one eye, and we know he experienced not just post-traumatic amnesia, but retrograde amnesia. All these findings and ideas culminate into the theory that not only are Ivan and the complex entangled, but this entanglement has led to ripple effects being felt in both the complex and Standard because of the anchor that links them together. If Ivan never existed, Standard and the complex would not be inevitably connected, nor would Standard be essentially leaking into the complex. But he does, all because Ivan wanted to be the first person to attain sustained fusion ignition through inertial confinement fusion. What a shame. So, what do you guys think? Do you think the plane the complex exists on is a brain or some other higher dimensional plane? Do you think Ivan and the complex are intrinsically connected, or that the null zones are a type of perceptual system that allow information from Standard to be absorbed by the complex? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed the video, consider liking and subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications so you don't miss another upload or stream of mine. I've got a lot of content on the way, and I even made a post on my channel a while ago with the rough release order of said content. And I'm really looking forward to you guys seeing my analysis branch out from Kane's stuff into other series and properties that I enjoy. But that's enough of me rambling. I hope you guys take care, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!